Hope that you are not taking it as a simple equal to my friend Christian when I underline too, but I really feel honored by your invitation, and in the name of the city, we feel honored by being among the finalists of your this year's award on urbanism among the European Cities of the Year, I believe. Just to come back to the introduction, to emphasize this role in the business improvement district, well, that's simply been an import from New York that I had the chance to do in the 90s when the time was not right for realizing the idea of the continent. It was only in the last decade when, due to a change of majority, others took over my impulse, my idea, and eventually realized it. But it's true that this wasn't very much due to the fact that we are a state and are able to have our own legislation on this level of the 16 states or Länder in Germany, where change was needed to back up this strategy. Anyway. It was already mentioned that Antwerp as well as Hamburg are second cities, and I totally agree with your feeling comfortably with this role, but also being second in this row of three cities being presented tonight makes me quite happy, as it gives me the chance, and also you, it gives also you the chance to see by comparing that indeed these cities and many more are really European cities in the sense that many issues are similar, many challenges, many problems, and also the approaches of tackling problems and finding solutions. Nevertheless, the answers are of course different. There are no recipes. I love cooking, even slow food cooking, but beware of recipes, of simple recipes. Well, the size of Hamburg is a bit bigger than the one of Antwerp, and the question of who is being the second port in Europe may be answered in the way that perhaps we have been second port. We have actually in those days considered problems in terms of having more difficulties to dredge the river. These about 100 kilometers distance between Hamburg and the North Sea, which is a continuous task, and environmental initiatives more and more fight against the giving of permissions to dredge the river in the way it is necessary continuously. Only recently we had a court decision to at least stop dredging before final decision has been made. So maybe in the present and in the future we will be the second. Maybe we have been in the past. Maybe enough to this subject. How does this work? Well, the invitation to speak here gave me especially a chance of reflecting myself on these last about 20 years that you asked for, and on milestones I personally witnessed during this period, working all this time in Hamburg. So I decided to identify 4 key issues, 4 key learnings. And I begin with the issue of waterfronts as an asset to urban development. This has very much to do with the dramatic changes in the requirements on port infrastructure and port structure, as to be seen on this picture. The traditional port, of course, in the period when goods were transshipped more or less by hand, an efficient port had a maximum of key length and a maximum number of ship berths to handle as many ships as possible at the same time, as the handling, as the transshipping took at this time. With the triumph of the container, but in my view can really be compared to the invention and the triumph of the microchip, in the sense that the speeding up of the international exchange of goods is really due to this invention in a similar way as the exchange of data was speeded up by the microchip. But this triumph of containerization changed dramatically the requirements on ports. As today, it's not about having all these little basins and all these words, but having spacious territory behind the coastline. On the other hand, the time ships are staying in the port is reduced to hours only. So the contrary is necessary, and that's been basically the reason why in many port cities these waterfront projects came about. Not because people started to love living by the water, but because the harbor functions, the harbor requirements changed tremendously. And this was in Hamburg, especially in the case, and for the first time the case, along the oldest part of the port, which was a national port, just simply along the northern river coast. And that's been the place where, since the late 80s, Hamburg developed what today is known as, we try to promote as the so-called chain of pearls, not only because the individual projects are so well done, but primarily because the concept behind was that of, well, let's say slow urbanism. It was a concept of getting step-by-step sites converted, be it by rebuilding, be it by reusing existing historical structures such as warehouses, etc. And today we have a real mix of old and new, and a line of new projects with new life along this former harbor, birth. Of course, this continued, as you know all, with Hafen City. Then in the 90s, part of the harbor was still operating until the late 80s, so there was in no means a kind of decayed area or harbor brownfield or so. But in view of the change of requirements, the harbor had to decide in the city, as the city owns the harbor in Hamburg, whether one would transform this area that could have been transformed into a modern container terminal just by refilling the basins opposite downtown, or, and that was clearly decided, to give the harbor a new piece of land westwards down the river, and to get this back to the city to which it belonged 100 years ago, as a substantial chance to expand the inner city. Quite often, harbor areas, brownfields of any kind, are not that centrally situated, and this is a particular chance in Hamburg to have the possibility of expanding the inner city. I think at the same time it was a new chance to create a new type, at least for Hamburg, a totally new type of public space, which you can see a bit in this slide, by using these basins as, in a sense, in a way, normally public green would work. As saying that I took over from the Netherlands, blue can be green. Of course, we have parks and houses too, but we have these basins with floating platforms, we have these terraces going down to the water, we have walkways and promenades along, and all this together makes the public spaces between the built-up areas particularly attractive. Second learning is about how to organize growth. Of course, this supposes that there is growth at all, and many cities and communities in the East are not growing, they are decreasing at the moment. But Hamburg, since the German reunification especially, is indeed a steadily growing city. There was a very fast growing in the 90s that had to be coped with, and that was indeed a period where there was no point in discussing practicing slow urbanism. We just had to house another 140,000 people in 2 or 3 years when they came from the eastern cities of Germany. But of course, this was after the Rio conference and after the Agenda 21, and so despite the fact that the historical scheme of development and growth for Hamburg that was unchanged for decades, stemming from the 20s of the 20th century, it is what you see here in black and white, the so-called finger plan or something like this, or kind of axis, already was, in a sense, a sustainable pattern, as it kept free from building the green lines between the main axes. This scheme could no longer be continued in the sense of ever more going outward or of even filling up these green spaces between. So the city gave itself an informal overall master plan to concentrate growth in a zone around the inner city where there are concentrated most of the places to be rebuilt, to be redeveloped, such as industrial brownfields, former military sites, railway yards, etc. And of course, among these, in an important role also the harbor conversion areas. But not only they are contributing to an inward growth. We are organizing since really the 19th century. As I said, we have railways such as this one in the west of Hamburg, where thousands of new homes will be built in the future, but where in the same time a big chance can be realized to kind of live together, or even live together, I'd like to say, the urban tissue, where before a huge barrier of railways separated quarters from each other. We have former military sites that I mentioned that used to be a harbor function that was a brewery just up the slope where you find the central harbor situation for touristic traffic, and even in the inner city, inside the former fortification ring, where in the past office use have spread enormously. We try to regain quarters and sites, and building by building try to reintroduce housing in this part of the city. Thirdly, we are more faced with global challenges. We have only learned to be a European city recently, and already are faced with finding ourselves on a global map and with global challenges, among which you know them all very well, are basically two dimensions: the economic globalization, the growing flow of migration, being nationally, being internationally. People that are going to the big hubs, the big cities, concentrating there, causing problems of education, at least of housing them there. But also the climate change is really an issue, especially for Hamburg, as the city is very aware of this issue due to the fact that 1/3 approximately of the city would be threatened by high tide floods if there weren't those dikes that meanwhile have been enhanced and heightened in a way that the city is safe and will be safe for a certain period, even in view of the worst forecasts. But in the 1960s we had this traumatic event of breaking dikes in a stormy night, with hundreds drowned, and that is still in the memory of people. And so the need of coping with climate change is very recognized in Hamburg. This might have led in a way to the fact that we have been European green capital in the last year, as much has been done about, for instance, reducing CO2 emissions in Hamburg. But of course, the criteria for the European green capital have been quite broad and comprised also innovative solutions for development, of course, sustainable development in the city, and just two examples to be mentioned here to be seen now. This shows you the project of covering a motorway that runs in a valley-like situation for a number of kilometers in the west of Hamburg by a lid. And by doing so, first of all, you now kind of control the emissions, taking away from the neighboring areas noise and air pollution. But at the same time, we are gaining land. We will not build actually on this lid, but we will move workers' gardens that do exist currently alongside the motorway on the lid, together with some public path and public green. So it's kind of a garden park in the future. Again, the chance of linking together quarters being separated today by the infrastructure, and eventually getting the possibility of developing for housing and other uses those areas that are being left by these gardeners. Just 1 minute, just 2 slides, I think, or 3. Just another example, it was already mentioned. We are preparing since a couple of years an international urbanism and architectural exhibition that will have this final presentation in the next year, to which I am that you are coming to Hamburg and see what eventually was the outcome. It's all a big experiment. I'm not going to explain in detail the system and principle of the international building exhibitions in Germany now, but they do exist since around 100 years, and the key question is always what is or what are the biggest current challenges to city development, and how could one create innovative answers to these challenges in a given quarter, and at the same time improve living conditions in that quarter. Eventually, we do not have to forget for whom we are doing all this. Of course, it is the people who are living in the city, and so the growing demand for public participation, for inclusion, and for actually the right to the city is a reality in Hamburg too. We have even occupied houses meanwhile, demonstrating this energy and this political activity. And despite the fact that there is and will still be our representative democratic system, Hamburg introduced meanwhile features of, let's say, plebiscitary action, but this only works in the sense of opposing or objecting projects, not in the sense of actively creating things. And so, in addition to that, we introduced, and that will be my last slide, a certain system of improving public participation beyond what is legally asked, developing a whole range of tools from public discussions on seminars to empower people actually in planning questions, and ending up with planning together. And finally, we also try and get kind of contracts and alliances with stakeholders that are not to be forgot. It's not only the people, but should be integrated, but the whole of the city should cooperate with the planners here to have eventually a city that belongs to To whom? To the citizens. Thank you very much.